Hey guys, welcome back to the studio. Today I'm going to be working on a small landscape piece, and this is a 16 by 12 inch canvas board, and of course I'm working with oil paints. Now this video is going to be focusing mainly on the beginning stages, and this is a crucial step where we lay down the foundations of a painting, and having a good base and starting point to work from is really going to help us later down the track. Now of course oil paints are very forgiving, you can always rework or go over certain areas, but getting the composition and form right at the start is really going to save you a lot of time and frustration later on. Okay, so the first step in starting the painting is having a good reference to work from. You can paint from imagination if you're able to, but when I tried this, all my landscapes ended up looking the same, usually with a mountain in the distance, trees on either side, and a path through the middle. But if you have the skills, by all means, you can paint from imagination. But me personally, I always use references. So what makes a good reference? When thinking about composition, there are 4 things that I look out for, and those are perspective, leading lines, the rule of thirds, and lighting. If you can tick these 4 off, then chances are you've got a good reference. So what do I mean by those? I'm going to use my reference as an example, which is a photo I took while I was in Norway last year. The rule of thirds is a guideline on how an image should be structured. The principle is if you divide your picture into equal thirds, both horizontally and vertically, the focal points of the picture should be located roughly on these lines or where the lines intersect. This apparently is what makes the image more interesting to the viewer. So in my reference, the strip of land is located along the bottom horizontal line, with the slope of the nearest mountain meeting the grass roughly at the bottom right intersection. The top of this mountain range lies along the top horizontal line, with the peak being at the top left intersection. So this picture clearly follows the rule of 2/3. Another point was perspective, and I'm sure you all basically know what this is, but to summarize, perspective is how we perceive distance, and it does this in 2 ways. The first is scale. We can roughly tell how far away something is based on its size. The further away something is, the smaller it will appear. So using my reference as an example again, this tree here is so much bigger than the trees on the mountain slopes. Your brain knows that the size disparity isn't going to be that much, and therefore realizes that the trees on the mountain slopes must be that much further away. And the second way perspective works is with color, and this is known as atmospheric perspective or aerial perspective. The way this works is the further away something is, the paler and less saturated the colors are, and also the colors of all distant objects tend towards blue. Which is why the mountains in this picture have a bluish cast to them, while the foreground objects have very vibrant colours. Now, leading lines is a great compositional technique that moves the viewer's eye through the painting to the focal point. So in this image, the focal point is the horizon, and within this image I've got all these lines coming from the slopes and the base of the mountains, the river's edge and the reflections, and they all lead to this focal point right here. So it takes the viewer on a journey, and it just makes the composition more interesting. And the last component was lighting, and this is really important. There needs to be some tonal dynamic in the image, as this is what gives it that 3-dimensionality. It makes the colours more saturated and helps convey the emotion or mood of the picture. Paintings without good lighting tend to appear flat and are generally not appealing to the viewers. So in this image, I've got the main light source coming from the left-hand side, and that really lights up the sides of the mountains and trees, and this creates some really nice shadows as well. So those are the 4 things I look out for when getting references for landscapes, and now that we've got a great reference, we can actually start the painting. Okay, so the first step I'm going to be doing is drawing an initial sketch, and this is where we define where everything is going to be in the painting. To do this, I've mixed a bit of burnt umber with liquid original to make the paint quite runny, and then with this dagger brush I literally draw the outline of the objects. Now I'm doing this freehand as I think it's important to keep training your eye to be able to judge distance and proportion, and having this skill will really help you if you go on to paint other subjects like portraits. But at the beginning, if you struggle with this, I would advise you use the grid method, which will give you a little helping hand. To do this, you would draw identical grids on your reference and canvas. For example, divide it into thirds like I did earlier. Then you can see where the lines on the reference intersect with the grid, and therefore you know where to place these points on the canvas. Okay, so that's pretty much the sketch. It's pretty simple, but I find it's very important, so definitely worth spending the time to get it right. So moving on, we can start working on the blocking. I always like to start with what is furthest away, so in this case that will be the sky. I'm using a fairly large brush to cover the canvas quickly, and right now I'm using a mixture of cerulean blue, phthalo blue and titanium white, and I've also added a touch of linseed oil which will help increase the flow of the paint. Now for the block-in, generally you want it to dry pretty quickly so you can work on the next layer. So I would actually advise you use Liquin, which is a fast drying medium. Linseed oil actually increases the drying time of oils. I only used it because I ran out of Liquin. I'm keeping the paint quite thin as I want it to dry faster, and I also need to be able to work over it to put in the clouds. Thicker paint will increase the drying time and make it harder to work over. Now, as we talked about atmospheric perspective before, the sky pales as it recedes into the distance. So at the top the blues are going to be more saturated, and as I work down the canvas I add more white to the mix to desaturate. For the clouds, I start by using a shadow colour that I mixed with burnt umber, ultramarine blue, titanium white and quinacridone magenta, and using this colour I roughly paint in the underside of some of these cloud structures. This will mix slightly with the blue colour underneath, but it should still sit over the top. Now I use a midtone which is just comprised of the shadow colour with more titanium white in it, and using broad gestural marks I just place these in selective areas. Then I go in with the lighter colour and marking where the highlights will hit. In this stage I don't worry so much about blending or anything, and it's more a case of just sculpting the form of the objects. Moving on to the mountains, I'm going to start with what is furthest away again, which are these mountains on the right hand side. I'm using the same brush and I just defined that edge where the mountain meets the sky. There isn't much tonal definition here as it's so far away, so I've simplified the colours to a shadow and a highlight, and these are actually quite similar to the colours we used for the clouds. Once that's in, I start working on the next mountain, and this one is nearer to the viewer, so the colours have been darkened and there will be more tonal contrast. I've also introduced a pale green to indicate some of the forests. Moving forward still, I really deepen the tones and I put in the shadow sides. This is a mixture of ultramarine blue and burnt umber, which leans more towards the blue side. I mix a paler blue-grey for the highlighted rocky areas, and also a few darker blue-green shades for the forests. Again, I've simplified these shapes into blocks and I painted those blocks with a solid colour. At this stage I don't want to focus too much on all the details and textures, as we need to first have a foundation to build upon. At the base of the mountain leading to the bank of the river, there are these dry yellow grasses. The area that is visible at the base of the mountain are less saturated, so this mixture consists of yellow ochre with burnt umber and titanium white, and this should give you a pale yellow colour. For the taller dry grasses in the foreground, I use less of the burnt umber and more of the white to paint the tops, and I do this by making quick vertical strokes with the brush. At the base of the grasses, the colours are richer in colour, so I add a mixture of yellow ochre with burnt umber and vermilion red. So now I go on to start putting in some of the reflections in the water. I'm going to be using the same colour mixes that I used previously, and I start by using this shadow colour and dragging it down in the opposite direction. I'm literally mirroring what's above, but as there is movement in the water, the reflection will be distorted slightly, so it doesn't matter if it's not perfect. We just need to get it somewhere close. Now I said I always paint what's furthest away first, and that also applies to the reflections, so I really should have started with the sky. The reason for this is the nearer objects overlap whatever's behind, so it's easier to get a nicer edge when you paint this way. I noticed that I made the mountain edge a little too wide when comparing it to what it's mirrored from, so I just cut back into it with the sky colour until it's the correct shape. As you can see, this is all very rough and gestural. All the blocking needs to do is define the form and leave you something to build on when you later go in with the detail. None of the colours are 100% correct, and even the shapes will need to be tweaked slightly, but it's close enough and we now have something to work on. Well, there you have it. That's how I go about starting a landscape painting. I hope you found this useful, and if you did, please give it a thumbs up, and also don't forget to subscribe and click that notification icon so you won't miss any of the next videos. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.